I want to begin. Thank you. I better do the same myself because I've got a job to do is doing that. It won't let me now, actually, Gloria, because somebody else is doing it. So there we are. So we turn to God with our prayers at the beginning of this session. Father, we ask you to send your Spirit upon us, that you open our minds to the Spirit within each one of us, the Spirit that draws us together, the Spirit that gives us understanding, the Spirit that opens us to your presence in so many other people, in so many different ways. We pray that you guide our minds, that you guide our discussions, and that all that we do, all that we discuss, will be for your greater glory and for the good of the whole family of the Christian Church. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. So, you're very welcome again. And CARJ has been doing an awful lot this year. And it's been a good year in that sense, because of, although it's probably become a good year for the wrong reasons. In other words, the killing of George Floyd. And that has created such a reaction across the world and brought so much more work for ourselves. A bad thing to happen, but good in the sense that it's raised our profile and that we responded to so much. So Catholic Associates came to us and asked us to do a series of workshops, which we've done, and they seem to go very successfully. We had a great workshops for creating champions for racial justice. I might get this wrong because I'm not in it as much as some of the characters in CARJ. And then we've also given workshops in seminaries, 2 seminaries, Allen Hall and Oscott. And they've all been going, everything's been going tremendously well in terms of the reaction, in terms of people engaging. And at the same time, there's been a development of all sorts of terminology coming out as the racial justice discussion or dialogue takes place. And one of the elements that's come out in that has been critical race theory. And so we wanted to, we realized it was a very complex concept and that it's a difficult one to understand. And there are different definitions almost of this, and people come at it from different angles. So we thought it would be a very opportune time today to begin to look. There are other terms that come out as well, like intersectionality and all sorts of different things that we're not going to look at today, but the one that we're going to home in on is critical race theory. So to begin that process, Richard is going to talk about Derrick Bell, as it were, the person from whom critical race theory came in the USA. And then later, Margaret Ann will talk about its development in this country and what it means now, how we, at least we'll try and sort it out in that way. So we're going to begin, first of all, by going to Richard. So I'm going to pass over to Richard now.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. I have to ask you, Gloria, to make me a co-host or something so I can share my screen.
I've just done that.
Okay. Now, share.
We'd help you with this slideshow.
Yeah, where do I go? I don't have this up. Where's my?
Oh, it's not there now.
Okay.
Then you go there. Okay.
Sorry. Anyway, good morning again. In discussing critical race theory, a very controversial, very complicated, often possibly misunderstood movement of ideas and people, we thought we wanted to look at the origins, and the origins are outside the UK, in the USA. And we thought we didn't want to just give you an analysis of what had gone on in the USA in the movement of critical race theory, but we thought we'd start with some of the people and their ideas and thinking, which have developed since. So we're going to start with Derrick Bell, who is thought of as being the father of critical race theory. A very interesting man and interesting thinker. And I want to start by giving you a quick overview of his biography. Derrick Bell was born in 1930, a Black baby, grew up in a Black neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He did well enough in school, graduated from Duquesne University in 1952, and then served 2 years in the Air Force, one of those years in Korea, the Korean War. He returned home from the Air Force and earned a law degree at the University of Pittsburgh. So quite a success story for a young man from a Black neighborhood in Pittsburgh. After law school, a couple years after law school, from 1960 until 1966, Bell worked on the staff of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund in New York. During his years with the fund, those 6 years, he supervised or actually worked directly on some 300 school desegregation cases across the South of the United States. So this was a real learning process, to be working in the South, working on desegregation cases, not particularly liked by white Southerners who felt it had been foisted upon them, but experiencing how the law worked and how the law actually worked for people in courts in the South on these sorts of controversial issues. And keep in mind also that he was working for, not for some left-wing radical organization. The NAACP was a strong, very committed civil rights organization. But if anything, it was thought of in those days as centrist, probably a bit to the right of Martin Luther King, not a right-wing organization at all, and a very important organization and still there today. But again, he was working right in the heart of civil rights. In 1968, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, universities sought to bring Black academics onto their staffs. And Bell received an offer from Harvard Law faculty in the fall of 1969. He accepted the offer, went to Harvard, obtained tenure, and became the first Black law professor at Harvard Law School. In 1980, now he had been at Harvard for 10 years by now, during a sabbatical year, he was teaching at the University of Washington Law School in Seattle. That's in the far northwest of the United States. And in the state next door was the University of Oregon Law School, and he was offered the position as dean of the University of Oregon Law School, which he accepted and stayed there for 5 years. He returned to Harvard in 1986 and resumed his teaching, writing, and advocacy on racial issues. And in 1989, he, with 23 other Black scholars, met for the first critical race theory workshop at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin. In fact, I believe they actually met near the University of Wisconsin in a convent. He's still at Harvard, but in 1993, he was on leave from Harvard, and John Sexton, the dean at New York University Law School, offered him a visiting position at NYU, which he accepted. For the next 10 years or more, Bell worked at NYU on a year-by-year basis, every year renewing a one-year contract, because that's kind of what he wanted. It was a really productive time for him, and he was happy there. He produced nearly a book a year during that 10+ year period. So that's Derrick Bell's biography. Now we're going to look at some of his thinking. And I just want to say before we get into this, one of the things to look for as we run through his thinking is that he was not a linear thinker. He was not a rigid analyst, top down. This is what's true and this is what's false. He tried to look under the surface of history. He included storytelling in his way of working, of teaching. He was a person that had a very participative pedagogical approach. So this is not a man who comes in a very heavy way. If anything, it's a man who's constantly in dialogue. So keep that in mind as we run through bits to get a taste of his thinking. What he called revisionist history, he was critical of the standard version of American history as it's commonly understood, and especially where some saw steady progress over 2 or 3 centuries from slavery towards equality and justice. Bell sees occasional symbolic advances followed by retrenchment. 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps backward. 2 steps forward, 3 steps backward. 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. It was that sort of thing for Bell, and we're going to look at it just in a few key moments in American history. The passing of the Constitution, the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision in 1954, and the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s. So let's start on those. The United States Constitution in 1789 promises liberty and justice for all. But a number of clauses in the Constitution left a place for slavery. In his book, And We Are Not Saved, Bell has the Chronicle of the Constitutional Contradiction. Now, just a word about his chronicles. One of Bell's ways of communicating was fictional stories. And many of them are called chronicles. So where you see one of Bell's chronicles, you're talking about something that's a bit like a parable. It's a story that has an important meaning on an important issue, but it's told in the way of storytelling. So the Chronicle of the Constitutional Contradiction, he has a fictional character, Geneva Crenshaw, who time travels back 2 centuries to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And she enters into dialogue and challenges the framers of the Constitution to reconsider the contradiction they're creating by incorporating slavery into the US Constitution. In the dialogue that follows in the story, the framers tell Geneva that this compromise is necessary if they're to form a government. They can only form a federal government that unites the North and the South if they make a compromise in that fundamental document, the United States Constitution. So he saw the Constitution as an important document, but also a slightly flawed document. The Emancipation Proclamation in the run-up to the Civil War. It's often seen as Lincoln's executive order which freed the slaves. And although the Emancipation Proclamation abolished the legal rights of slave masters, it did not give the slaves themselves new rights. And it left them defenseless against resubjugation under the Black Codes, and they were left with neither the money nor the means necessary for survival in a still racially hostile world. So even this great document of emancipation led to problems as well as new possibilities. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment in 1865 formally abolished slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States. However, soon after it was passed, in the South, it was rendered irrelevant by the establishment of a sharecropping system, which basically gave the same labor benefits as slavery to the plantation owners without the minimum obligations inherent in the slave master's role. So again, an important step, but not a perfect step by any means. And out of it comes big negatives as well as positives. The 14th Amendment, 3 years later, prohibits any state denying any person the right to life, liberty, and property. However, corporations were deemed to be persons. And for several generations, corporations received far more judicial protection than Black people. Another step forward with a step backward. Although Black people gained the right to vote in the 15th Amendment in 1870, for almost a century, the federal government failed to enforce the 15th Amendment effectively. So you can see how Bell looks back on this legal history of events and documents that set the stage and seem to be a steady move forward, and sees the problems as well as the possibilities. Brown versus the Board of Education was a Supreme Court decision that did away with the notion of separate but equal and moved to a commitment to desegregation. And in the view of some, Brown is the greatest Supreme Court decision of all time. However, remember, Bell worked for 6 years on desegregation cases after this in the South. And he questioned whether desegregation always guaranteed Black children better schooling. He also noted from his experience in the South that in a number of desegregation cases, the lawyers sometimes wanted integrated schools. Wanted the integration, maybe implied in his criticism, is at the expense of good schools. The Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s, there was about 5 of these during the 1960s. And they basically gave new protections based on the civil rights movement. And Bell felt that these made a real difference. However, he did note that these often addressed only instances of overt discrimination. They didn't deal with neutral policies that had a negative impact on Black people. Okay, so you see that history, that legal history of important documents relative to the to civil rights, to slavery, to civil rights, to desegregation. Bell saw a different history than is the one normally thought of as US history. And instead of seeing a steady move toward greater and greater equality, he saw a very uneven move toward some improvement. Bell spoke of himself as a racial realist. He believed that Black people's struggle for freedom, justice, and dignity is as old as the nation. But even with the civil rights movements and periodic victories in legislation, Black Americans, by and large, were not equal to whites. Racial equality was, in fact, and this is depressing, but this is how he felt. Racial equality was, in fact, not a realistic goal. Black people would never gain full equality in the USA. This was not, though, for Bell, a prescription of despair nor a counsel of surrender. It was a more realistic perspective from which to move toward change. He never gave up the struggle for change, but he also didn't believe in steady progress and didn't really have a very strong hope for total equality. And I'll just say that Martin Luther King is quoted himself as once saying, white people and Black people have a different notion of equality. White people think it's a step forward toward equality. Black people think it's actual equality. And it's that actual equality that Bell was skeptical would ever take place. Storytelling.
Just a warning, Richard, you only have 5 minutes left, so just
okay, I'll do my best. Bell saw storytelling as a means by which people at the margins could introduce their views into the dialogue. These are just a few of the many, many chronicles, fictional stories, parables, if you want. One was the Chronicle of the Constitutional Contradiction that we looked at before, with Geneva time traveling back to the Constitutional Convention. Another very famous one is the Chronicle of the Space Traders. And in this story, aliens come to Earth and they see how bad the situation is between white and Black. And they offer white Americans, or they offer Americans and their government, wealth from their own star that they come from and support. In exchange, and this was the thing, they wanted to take away all the Black people from America. America went through a long process of consultation and agreed to have the wealth and support with the Black people taken away. So all the Black people are taken into spaceships and begin the journey through space to a faraway star with a very advanced culture where they, the Black people, would be treated truly as equals. Now, I won't tell you the end of the story. You can find it and read it for yourselves. It's interesting. Another chronicle, the Chronicle of the Divine Gift, and divine is the name of the person. And this is a story about someone who is appointed by affirmative action. Bell's pedagogical process, some might be surprised by this, because critical race theory is often attacked as a rigid anti-racist approach. But it's interesting that Bell was very, very well known for his very participative pedagogical approach. Over the years, he concluded that student interest in learning was enhanced if the students were actively engaged in the learning and teaching process. So his teaching was very participative. In fact, he mentions the approach of Paulo Freire, where students become teachers and teachers become learners. Bell's faith and theology. He had a conundrum. He thought of racism as permanent, and yet at the same time, he insists that the struggle against racism remains worthwhile and valuable. So he had to deal with that paradox. And it's often thought that he may have been influenced by the work of the 20th century American Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who had a similar paradox running through his theology. The importance of religion in Bell's writing became increasingly overt in his later books, Gospel Choirs and Ethical Ambition. Bell spoke of his religious upbringing in the Protestant Black Church and his continuing religious faith. He describes himself as Christian, but his faith is not narrowly contained within traditional Christian doctrine, but he describes himself as Christian, and I think it's genuine. Bell sees critical race theory as a serious attempt to change American culture. But, and this is his task, but changing culture must begin with a radical assessment of that culture. So his thinking, his legal work, his work with other scholars is to make that radical assessment. What is this culture really like, and how can we move it forward? Radical assessment can involve illustration, anecdote, allegory, and so on, as well as analysis. For Bell, critical race theory is a body of scholarship, a majority of whose authors are people of color and committed to the struggle against racism. The work is sometimes disruptive because its commitment to anti-racism goes well beyond civil rights, integration, affirmative action, and other liberal measures. The first meeting of the critical race theory movement was a 1989 critical race theory workshop in Madison, Wisconsin, attended by Bell and 23 other scholars of color, and it marked a turning point for that movement. The workshop was spearheaded by Kimberly Crenshaw and organized by a couple others. Also included in the participants were Derrick Bell, Richard Delgado, Patricia Williams, and it was called the New Developments in Critical Race Theory. And following this meeting, publishing by these scholars took a step forward. Kimberly, briefly, a couple of the people that were in this early group. She was born in 1959 in Ohio. She's an American lawyer, civil rights advocate, philosopher, scholar of civil rights theory. She was one of the organizers of the first workshop. She went on to write and speak on intersectionality, especially. She's co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum, and she's today a professor at Columbia Law School and UCLA Law School. So these aren't weirdos, left-wing kooks. Richard Delgado is the son of a Mexican-American immigrant, a legal scholar, taught civil rights and critical race theory at the University of Alabama. He wrote the Derrick Bell Reader with his wife, Jean Stefanchik. He's interested in some of the different racial minorities in the States. In some of his writings, he discusses how society racializes one group at the expense of another. The history of minority groups in America is one where, while one group is gaining ground, another is often losing it. Patricia Williams was born in Boston in 1951, received her bachelor's degree from Wellesley College, went on to study at Harvard, where she was research assistant to Derrick Bell. Soon after the 1989 workshop, she published The Alchemy of Race and Rights. Critical race theory movement has continued to develop in the USA. but around 2002, it transitioned to the UK and has developed here over the last 20 years. So that's our glimpse at its origins in the USA, especially around Derrick Bell and the first group of 24 critical race theory scholars. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. I'm going to give you an extra 5 minutes because I thought you were going to need them, but you weren't far over your time at all, really, only 2 minutes over your time. So thank you very much for that. And for the great content as well. We're not going to take questions at this stage. So if there are questions that come up in the chat, or if you want to save them until after Margaret Ann has spoken, then we'll bring the two of them together for a while, and then we'll go into smaller groups. But let's go into Margaret Ann talking about critical race theory as it's developed more in this country.
Thanks, Father Phil. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation and I have a lot of writing, but I will put it forward as clearly as I can. And Gloria has assured me that it'll be available through CARJ after the meeting. So you will be able to access it if you want to see it, more of the facts. So I'm going to begin. As Richard has said, critical race theory transitioned to the UK in the early 2000s. So compared to its solid foundation in the US, it's still in its infancy in Britain. Richard also mentioned that the first meeting of the CRT movement in the US was a workshop in 1989 and was attended by 24 scholars. So what happened following the 1989 workshop in Wisconsin to bring CRT to the UK in the early 2000s? Unlike the US, it was educationalists rather than lawyers who have been at the forefront of the movement since its inception in the UK. And it was as a result of the cross-fertilization of ideas between educationalists in the US and the UK that CRT arrived on these shores. It was around the mid-1990s when CRT entered educational theory in the US, notably with the publication of the paper Towards a Critical Race Theory of Education by Gloria Ladson-Billings and William F. Tate. So in Ladson-Billings' own words, she describes, after extensive reading, Tate and I wrote a draft of a paper that tried to both explain CRT and describe its relevance and application to education. This paper was then presented at the 1994 annual meeting of the American Educational Research Association. Ladson-Billings continues. During the question and answer section of the presentation, it was clear that some of the attendees were hostile to this new theoretical perspective. Surprisingly, the hostility came from some of the scholars who were typically allies, scholars whose work focused on multiculturalism and diversity. Apparently, our focus on race as a primary tenet of inequality violated the sacred rule of maintaining race, class, and gender triumvirate. The friendly fire we received as a result of making race the axis of understanding inequity and injustice in the US spurred us to write what became the first article on CRT in education. And that is the aforementioned article that Towards a Critical Race Theory of Education. So what happened was these educationalists in the US decided, CRT could apply to education. They put it forward in a meeting and they got bombarded with criticism for it. And instead of retreating, they decided to go forward. So Ladson, Billings, and Tate continued their extensive research into CRT and education. And Ladson Billings wrote, in 1998, I published an article that attempted to dissuade education researchers from delving into CRT without adequate grounding in the field. During this time, Derrick Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, and Richard Delgado, who you've all just heard about, made visits to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we had opportunities to sit and talk with them about our project. Bell urged caution. You can see that from what Richard said. He was a cautious guy. Bell urged caution. Crenshaw encouraged us to keep reading in the field and keep spreading the word. Delgado was especially excited to hear about the work and was interested in possible collaborations. And it was Delgado who encouraged them to reach out to others in this field. And that's exactly what happened. These American scholars reached out to British educationalists and began sharing their research. And on November 20th, 2006, the first CRT International Seminar took place in the UK at the Educational and Social Research Institute, the ESRI, at Manchester Metropolitan University. It sought to explore CRT's value as an analytical tool for making sense of enduring inequalities across the globe. So this was an international conference that was really set up by the American scholars, but it took place in the UK. Following the seminar, the ESRI in its evaluation wrote, and I quote, "It proved to be a resounding success with over 30 participants and has paved the way for future research possibilities and even more international collaboration." So 30 participants, I mean, it wasn't vast, but for 2006, it was brand new, especially in the UK. So they considered 30 participants a resounding success. At the ESRI conference, papers were presented by 3 British educationalists, David Gilbourne, John Preston, and Namita Chakrabarti. They were 3 early pioneers in their field, and their work is still preeminent. In the following year, 2007, at the British Education Research Association, BERA, at least 6 CRT-focused papers were presented. So it had doubled between 2006 and 2007. BERA, which describes itself as, I quote, "the leading authority on educational research in the UK, supporting and representing the community of scholars, practitioners, and everyone, defines CRT this way. Critical race theory is a body of scholarship steeped in radical activism that seeks to explore and challenge the prevalence of racial inequality in society. It is based on the understanding that race and racism are the product of social thought and power relations. CRT theorists endeavor to expose the way in which racial inequality is maintained through the operation of structures and assumptions that appear normal and unremarkable." This was the first time that CRT had been discussed at BERA, and BERA had put forward the first British definition of CRT. So in addition to the papers, the 6 papers that were put forward at this conference, there was a symposium entitled, "Guess Who's Coming to BERA? Has Critical Race Theory Arrived in UK Education Research?" This was a clear sign of a growing interest among educationalists in the CRT movement. And since then, CRT has become a significant intellectual space for race-conscious scholars and activists in England. It remained largely the preserve of some academic departments for a few decades, but now it's spilling over into public life and institutions. And today, its practical influence in mission statements, professional development, and human resource policies has grown much more widely, especially since the Black Lives Matter protests last summer. But the grounding for this was being prepared long in advance. So perhaps the key to understanding the differences between CRT in the US and the UK is the comparative history of race and racism in the two nations. Richard has explained the legacy of race and racism in the US. I'm going to speak a little bit about it in the UK. Since the 1960s, many dimensions of the British education system have come under the scrutiny of Black British intellectuals. And it's from this historically grounded base that an interest in CRT developed in the UK. At its roots are the struggles for equity and justice, which were led by the Black Caribbean community starting in the 1960s. We hear a lot about the Windrush Generation, so I'll refer to it only briefly. I think you all know what I'm speaking about. In the post-war Reconstruction period, the UK sought additional labor power from its colonies, and the resulting migration led to substantial new settlements of Black people, especially in key industrial cities. The Black Caribbean community played a vital role in driving campaigns for racial justice in society, and particularly in education. The Black-white gap in educational achievement was one of their first key rallying points. Black children, the offspring of settlers from the new Commonwealth, that is the Caribbean, West Africa, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, began to populate British schools. The reason for this somewhat sudden influx was that many of those settlers who came to the UK were men who left their families behind in their countries of origin with the intention of sending for them when they were established in the UK, when they were settled. There was no immediate sense of urgency. And you have to remember the Windrush was in 1948, but throughout the 1950s, you had different migrations of people from the new Commonwealth coming and settling in Britain. In 1962, the UK government passed the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which introduced stringent restrictions on the entry of Commonwealth citizens into Britain. Before the act was passed, citizens of Commonwealth countries had extensive rights to migrate to the UK. The act ensured that only those with work permits, which were typically only highly skilled workers such as doctors, were permitted entry. So after the 1962 Act, when the doors were beginning to close, the workers sent for their families to join them in the UK, and schooling became a serious issue. There was no coherent, systematic body of thought or proper work being done about integrating Black, and by that I mean African, Afro-Caribbean, and Asian children into the school system. I think it was fairly well accepted, at least in retrospect, that racism was an endemic feature of British society at that time. Also at that time, many assumptions were made based on stereotypes. In addition, various local authorities were expressing concerns about overcrowding in their schools. Consequently, practices and procedures that had racist implications were often widely implemented. Despite political inaction and disinterest, pressure from Black parents and activists ultimately led to the government commissioning special inquiries that produced the first ever racial breakdown of examination achievement in results of students' ethnic origin. The first of these reports was Rampton in 1981, and then the Swan Report in 1985. The Swan Report is of particular significance because it was the first time in Britain that a commitment to multicultural aims in school and curricula had been established. This was before there was a national curriculum. Interestingly, this report 36 years ago introduced some concepts similar to those that some would now call CRT. For example, a call for educational content deemed to be relevant to pupils' lived experiences and being alert to unconscious racism. These things were back in the Swan Report in 1986. However, at this point, the overall context was one of celebrating cultural diversity within a broadly liberal framework. The more radical aspects of the report were really only taken up by a few inner city schools. In spite of the Swan Report, change came slowly, and even after formal practices and procedures evolved and changed, many of the stereotypes and assumptions were not reevaluated and remained entrenched in the education system. Phil, can I have a time check? No? Okay.
You've got 10 minutes yet.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so for example, research funded by the Economic and Social Research Council in 2012 demonstrated how little had changed in the education of Black Caribbean children over the previous decades and highlighted the continued significance of race inequality. It demonstrated that teachers tend to have systematically lower academic expectations for Black children, along with a regime of heightened disciplinary scrutiny and criticism. The findings further revealed that many Black Caribbean parents found that their high expectations and support for education were thwarted by racist stereotyping and exclusion. Many educationalists and activists in Britain find CRT to be a useful way for thinking about contemporary British inequalities. In particular, they're drawn towards CRT's structural understanding of racism, which Richard has spoken about. Although many people see racism as being an issue of prejudiced individuals with backward views, CRT sees racism not as being an issue of individual prejudice, but instead as being embedded in society's roots. In other words, CRT argues that you can have racism in society without necessarily having individual racists. Obviously, we do have individual racists, but it is a completely different thought process. Through this structural approach to racism, we're able to understand various facts about Britain, such as, and I'm going to use a shorthand BAME here, and I apologize in advance to those who feel that it's stereotyping or misleading, but the reports that I'm referring to tend to use BAME as British, Asian, and minority ethnic. So through the structural approach to racism that CRT adopts, we're able to understand the underrepresentation of BAME people at Russell Group universities, the overrepresentation of BAME people in underemployment, the fact that nearly half of BAME households in the UK are living in poverty. And we can do this without blaming these circumstances on individual racists. These inequalities are rather the result of structural factors in British society, including migration histories, housing segregation, unequal funding of schools, and the makeup of the economy, all of which stretch far beyond the actions of individuals. It's therefore somewhat ironic that many people criticize CRT for blaming racism on white people, something that was captured in the Equality Minister's remark that the theory sees, I quote, whiteness as oppression. Until this pronouncement, many people in the UK had never heard of CRT. Overnight, it became headline news. So this is what happened. In October 2020, there was a debate in the House of Commons, which had been motioned by the Labour Party to discuss Black History Month. The focus was to look at structural racism in education and to explore ways of decolonizing the curriculum. Some Conservative MPs took issue with the fact that Black History Month was even being raised in Parliament. One MP stated that to talk about Black history and Black History Month suggested that Britain was a country that was not, in his words, based on merit and character, and that he found that he was deeply offended by this suggestion. In the ensuing debate, Kemi Badenoch, the Equalities Minister, stated emphatically that critical race theory had to be rejected because it was, and I quote, an ideology that sees my Blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression. And I want to be absolutely clear that this government stands against critical race theory. She went on to say that any teacher promoting elements of CRT, such as white privilege and inherited white guilt, without offering counter arguments is breaking the law. According to the Guardian newspaper, which covered it extensively, this is a quote from the Guardian of the 23rd of October. Until this month, October 2020, according to the parliamentary record, Hansard, the term critical race theory had never once been uttered in the House of Commons chamber. By the end of the day on 20th October, however, it was of such importance that the government declared itself unequivocally against the concept. So what exactly is the government against and why? Well, some suggest that the UK has always been wary of race-conscious thought and discussion. Some CRT advocates would argue that what Kemi Badenoch was speaking about wasn't CRT at all. While Boris Johnson claims that we are, quote, a freedom-loving country who have been at the forefront of practicing and spreading democracy, CRT shows that Great Britain hasn't been great for everyone, given the endemic nature of racism in British society. CRT seeks to show how racial inequality is reproduced even without conscious approval. The COVID-19 pandemic provides a good example. We've seen across our front pages that BAME people have a higher death rate than the white population. However, with CRT's approach to racism, this isn't due to particular individuals failing to treat BAME hospital patients. It isn't even necessarily due to the government officials not caring for BAME people. Rather, what it's saying is that British society is structured in such a way that BAME people are disproportionately excluded across multiple areas such as housing, the economy, and education. A report in the Runnymede Trust found that BAME people, especially Black people, are more likely to work in what were formerly called low-skilled occupations, but have since been renamed key worker jobs. So they're at the front line at times like this. BAME people are also more than twice as likely to rely on public transport, which poses a higher risk of coronavirus transmission to get to work. And Black, African, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi, despite on average living in smaller properties than white people, are more than twice as likely to live in households of 4 or more people. CRT sheds light on these structural rather than individual relations, which disproportionately relegate BAME people to lower paying jobs, make them more likely to be exposed to the virus in order to get to their job, and make them more likely to pass the virus on to household members through overcrowding. These examples that I've cited above, some might think of as structural racism. Others might consider them to be examples of racial disadvantage. Still others might think of them as class differences. Critical race theory scholars would want to examine carefully the complex causes and influences that lead to and perpetuate such disparities. They would also want to consider carefully what actions might change the situation for the better, and what actions, however well intended, might be ineffective or counterproductive. We would agree that such disparities require careful investigation. So in summary, as Richard has outlined, CRT emerged in the US in the post-civil rights era. Legal scholars, notably Derrick Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, and Patricia Williams, developed CRT in the 1980s. Since its inception in the US, CRT has grown into an international interdisciplinary movement. Today, CRT is used extensively in analyses of education issues concerning race and racism in the UK. CRT is not, as Kemi Badenoch suggested, anti-white, and it does not portray all people of color as victims. It does, however, require us to rethink how we approach topics like racism and anti-racism. If racism is not an issue of individuals, but of structures, then successful anti-racism is not about the conversion of individual prejudiced people or about running diversity awareness training schemes, however helpful these may be. Anti-racism through a CRT lens is about the much more complex task of transforming how our economic, political, educational, and social network institutions work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret Ann. Great stuff. I think probably now we'll just give a few minutes for people just to think and then perhaps ask questions. If you want to ask any in the chat room, we'll give a 5 or 10 minutes after that for questions generally to Margaret Ann or to Richard, and then we'll go into chat room, into breakout rooms for 25 minutes. So if we just give you a couple of minutes just to think, have a little break, and then come back. So I'm going to start again in about 30 seconds. Okay, so there's a question in the chat room that says, I'd love to hear any thoughts on how CRT related to liberation theology, or perhaps more specifically, Black theology. Margaret Ann, do you want to comment on that?
I think that's more up Richard Street.
I think I often compare them in my own mind. They're not related in the sense of one drawing from the other, but I think they are related because in both cases, you have, like in liberation theology, you have a movement of, I'm going to say priests, but you know, obviously, who involve sorry, Phil, who involve basic Christian communities in a praxis and way of thinking that develops a theology from the grassroots. CRT is more a movement of scholars, but of scholars very involved with activists and trying, in both cases, trying to look at their society and think about how they assess their society and how they can best work with one another for change. So I see them both as movements of people who are thoughtful and reflecting on their own society with a view to change and involving ordinary people in the process.
And I would make the link as well with Black theology in terms of coming at it like Derrick Bell from a completely different angle, from a different experience altogether. And so not the traditional type of approach to things, that linear approach, but rather a very different approach to things. So there was a link there as well for me. There's a question as well about it's often being linked to Marxism. Can you shed any light on that?
Richard, do you want me to go? Okay.
Go ahead.
I think part of the reason for that is if you're taking a historical analysis, critical theory existed back in the 1920s, 1930s, and that came from a neo-Marxist school. I'm so sorry. That came from neo-Marxist thinking, and from that came critical. Sorry. I'm turning this off. That came from neo-Marxist thinking and led to, I forgot where I was actually. that led into critical legal thinking, critical legal theory, which then came CRT. But it does not have, in fact, it's criticized both by the right and by the left, because the Marxists feel it's not class-oriented enough. And that first meeting that I was speaking about, where it was linked to education in the US, there was a lot of criticism from Marxists because it wasn't focusing on class as an issue. It was putting race at the center. And I think that's one of the big differences. But in a lot of people's minds, it is a neo-Marxist movement, but the reality is something completely different. Richard, I'm sure you have something to add.
Well, critical theory, now not talking about critical theory developed in the Frankfurt School in Germany, and then moved on to other places. And even there was a strong element of neo-Marxism, if you want, but is very democratic thought, and also involved in things like psychoanalysis and so Eric Fromm and things like that. So it was a reflection on society, but it was not a narrowly rigid Marxist approach. Marxism was part of the thing. And then as critical legal theory developed in the USA, that they were very aware of critical theory, but they were developing their own particular approach. And when Derrick Bell went from critical legal theory to critical race theory with others, it's like any movement that, and I would say one more thing, you'll realize that liberation theology has almost identical criticisms as critical race theory. They think of it as being Marxist and etc.
Sorry about this. I'm trying to deal with my phone going at the same time as well. And I can't turn it off. The next question that I've got there is about Catholic social teaching, how CRT relates to that. And are we here really to try and develop how CRT relates to Catholic social teaching in any way? And surely we are. We haven't got all the answers. It is just the structures that you've heard being talked about and it being there. And it's for us actually to begin to see how it is impacting from a theological perspective as well, from a Catholic social teaching perspective. Do you want to say anything else, Richard?
I think this is a task for all of us.
Yeah.
And obviously there's some concept in Catholic social teaching like structural sin and things like that that overlap directly. But yeah, I feel instinctively that they're compatible. Like many things that are compatible with Catholic social teaching, they don't come from the same source and they have differences, but there are differences within both. You know, people that are dedicated to Catholic social teaching have differences, and people in critical race theory have differences. So the notion of, are they compatible? How do they build on one another? All those, that's really a work that we hoped this would help begin or to move forward, rather than something we have answers to.
And perhaps that's the time now to go into our breakout groups to discuss that sort of thing. We're going to divide you into groups. It'll be about of 8 people or something like that for 25 minutes and then come back. Within those groups, I would ask that initially you ask somebody from the group to be the recorder, to report back to us at the end. And then the 2 questions that we're asking you to look at during those groups as well. The first one is simply, what's the one thing that came to your mind as you were listening to us talking about this today? Just the first thing that comes to your mind in that sense. And then the second one is, how does CRT, how does critical race theory help you to deal with things in your particular situation? So those 2 questions, and perhaps again, that third one, you can respond about Catholic social teaching. So I'm going to ask now that Gloria put people into those groups, and you've got 25 minutes. So if you come back at 25 to.
Can I just add that we'll be putting the questions in the chat box so that you can reflect on it. I can't show it on a slide because once you go into the rooms, you don't see what's on the slide. So if you need to remind yourself of the questions, they will be in the chat box.
Okay.
Just a few of us left.
Yeah.
I have to go and make a phone call quickly. So.
Okay. Yeah. Good stuff.
I'll go through and tell people to, someone needs to report back, so.
Curtis and
Gloria, you're recording.
Sorry.
No, that's
Sorry
okay.
about that. I just needed to tell you we needed someone to feed back. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's
Is
great.
that all right? Yeah, that's
that,
fine.
yeah.
I'll leave you. I just wanted to, sorry, we forgot to let you know, okay?
That's great. Thanks, Gloria.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks. See you. Bye.
Okay.
And Gloria goes.
In 2001.
Sometimes about a lot of these things become very academic, and if I had to go and speak to people, I like the mention of Paulo Freire because and the liberation theology, because it's about simpleness, and I think even Catholic social teaching for a lot of people, because it's kind of,
hello everyone, sorry to break in.
no, you're okay.
I really apologize. Just to let you know that if someone could, you know, take notes and feedback, is that all right? After the session, someone can just give us a few lines about what you discussed. It could be anything. It doesn't have to be based around the questions as well. Is that okay? Thank you. And I'll let you
actually, just as Terry was speaking, I'm typing in a few notes in the chat.
Oh, good. That's fantastic. That's fine. Anything you feedback is fine. Yeah. Okay, I'll let you get on with it. Okay.
Thanks, boss.
Thank you.